Story number 1.
I had always been a night owl, so when I started working late at the small office downtown, it didn't bother me much. The building was old, worn down in some areas, but it had its charm. The creaky floors, the dim lights, and the distant hum of the air conditioning system were all things I had grown used to. I actually liked it when I was the only one there. Everyone else left by 6 p.m., and the office would go quiet, giving me the space I needed to concentrate. That particular night, I was working on a report that needed to be finished by morning. It was already 10:30 p.m., and I hadn't realized how much time had passed. My fingers typed away rhythmically, absorbed in the task. But then I heard it. Soft footsteps behind me. I froze, my hands stilling on the keyboard. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, and though faint, they were unmistakable. I quickly glanced behind me. The hallway leading to the restrooms and the stairwell was empty, bathed in a weak fluorescent light. No one was there. Maybe it was someone else still in the building? I doubted it. My colleagues were all gone by now, and there was no reason for anyone to still be working this late. I shook my head, trying to push it aside. It could just be the old building settling. There were strange sounds all the time, creaks, groans, the occasional rattle of the windows. It was nothing new. I turned back to my computer, but then the footsteps came again, this time closer. It wasn't the sound of the building shifting. This was different. It was a rhythmic, consistent pattern, almost as if someone was walking slowly, deliberately toward me. I could feel my heart rate pick up, my breath shortening. I turned around in my chair, half expecting to see one of my colleagues standing behind me, but no one was there. I stood up, my body tense, and walked over to the hallway. I scanned the area, empty. Nothing moved. The office felt eerily still. I returned to my desk and sat back down, trying to shake off the creeping unease that was slowly building in the pit of my stomach. The lights flickered above me, the sudden dimming and brightening of the bulbs making me jump. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus, but my nerves were on edge now. I turned back to the screen and kept working, but the feeling didn't subside. The air in the office felt thick, heavy, as though something or someone was watching me. I could feel my skin prickling, my every sense heightened. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination running wild. But then the voice came. It wasn't loud, it was barely a whisper, but it was there, just behind me. Go home, I froze. My blood ran cold, my hands shaking as I slowly turned in my chair. The office was still empty. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. I scanned the room again, my breath shallow, my mind racing. There was no one in sight, no one that could have spoken. The voice, however, had been clear enough for me to understand. I stood up again, my heart racing now. I could feel a cold draft sweep across my neck, and when I looked back toward my desk, I noticed something. My coffee mug, which had been sitting on the corner of the desk when I left for the hallway, was now sitting in the center of the desk. I hadn't moved it. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't just some creaky building. Something was happening here. Something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call someone for reassurance. But as I reached for it, I noticed the screen was cracked, a long spider web of fractures running across it. I hadn't dropped the phone. In fact, it had been perfectly fine when I used it earlier in the day. Now it was completely useless. I heard the footsteps again, this time unmistakable. They were growing louder, closer, like someone was walking directly behind me, only I couldn't see them. I turned around in a panic, but the office remained empty. The temperature dropped sharply, the air now bitterly cold, despite the office being warm just moments ago. The hum of the air conditioning had stopped, and the silence in the building felt oppressive. My mind raced, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. And then I heard it again. The voice. This time it was louder, clearer. Leave now. I felt a cold hand grip my spine, as if something were standing just inches away from me, breathing down my neck. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and bolted toward the door. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion as I ran through the hallway, past the dim-lit restrooms, toward the stairs. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, even though no one was there. I glanced over my shoulder, but the hall was empty. The stairs were even colder, and when I reached the exit door, I didn't hesitate. I threw open the door and bolted outside, breathing in the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat awake in my apartment, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. My mind kept replaying the sounds, the footsteps, the voice, everything. I tried calling my coworkers the next morning, but no one picked up. I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but something deep inside me told me that it had been real. Too real. The next day, I returned to the office. I had to know if I was just losing my mind or if something had actually happened. When I arrived, the building was just as I had left it. Quiet, empty, and still. But something felt different. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I walked through the empty halls, heading toward my desk, but as I turned the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The report I had been working on the previous night was now sitting on the edge of my desk. It had been opened. I hadn't left it like that. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The lights flickered again, and the temperature seemed to drop another few degrees, and then I heard it. The voice. Louder this time, more distinct than ever. Leave. It was all I could take. I turned on my heel and ran out of the office, never looking back. I never went back to that job. I couldn't. Every time I thought about that night, the footsteps, the voice, I felt like something was watching me. Something that didn't belong. I don't know who or what was in that office building, but I knew one thing for certain: I was never going to find out. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I was always the last person in the office, staying late to finish my work. I liked the quiet, the silence, the stillness of an empty building. It was peaceful, especially after the chaos of the day had died down. Most of the time, I could wrap things up and be out the door by 8 p.m. But on this particular night, I was running behind. I had to finalize a report for a client, so I stayed well past the usual hour. The office was eerily quiet as I typed away at my desk. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, casting a sterile, buzzing glow across the rows of empty cubicles. I glanced at the clock. It was already 10 p.m. I could feel the weight of fatigue creeping in, but I pressed on. It was just me now, alone in the building, the last few hours of peace before I could go home and rest. The building I worked in was old, one of those rundown office complexes that had been around for decades. The creaking floors and drafty windows gave it an air of decay, but I had grown used to it. Still, there were some nights when the old place seemed to have a life of its own. The halls would settle with strange noises, scratches, whispers, faint sounds that never quite made sense. I was working in one of the farthest corners of the office, tucked away in a small cubicle near the back of the building. It was dark outside, the faint glow of the city lights creeping in through the windows. I was so focused on my work that I didn't hear it at first. It started softly, a faint noise from the hallway. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning kicking on, or maybe the building settling. But then it came again, louder this time, a shuffling sound like footsteps. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The building was empty. I was certain of it. Everyone had gone home hours ago, and the security guard usually did his rounds every half hour. He wouldn't be back for another 20 minutes. It couldn't be anyone. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them now, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking down the hallway right outside my cubicle. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way anyone was supposed to be here. The office was locked up tight. My coworkers were gone. My eyes scanned the dark hallway, but there was no one there. No movement, no shadow of a figure. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The lights flickered above me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I walked cautiously down the hallway, my pulse quickening with each step. There was no one in sight. I stood there, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The building had always had its quirks, its strange little noises. But tonight felt different. Something was off. The air was heavy, cold, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I turned back toward my desk, but as I did, I noticed something. The lights in the break room at the far end of the hall were on. I hadn't seen anyone leave, so how could the lights be on? The break room was never left on, especially after hours. I made my way down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The break room door was slightly ajar, the light spilling out into the hall. My heart raced as I approached it. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to see someone inside. But the room was empty. Everything appeared normal, except for one thing. The coffee maker, which I knew had been turned off earlier in the day, was now on. Steam was rising from the pot as though it had just been used. My throat tightened with unease. I could feel a cold draft moving through the room, but the air conditioning had been off for hours. I reached for the coffee pot, my hand trembling slightly, and turned it off. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, a growing sense of dread washing over me. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I felt like I wasn't alone in the building anymore. I walked back toward my desk, trying to shake off the feeling. It was ridiculous. The coffee maker had probably been left on by someone earlier, and I had just missed it. My mind was playing tricks on me. But as I sat down again and resumed my work, I couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that something was wrong. That's when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time much closer. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. I saw nothing. There was no one in the hallway, no figure walking toward me. Yet the sound of those footsteps continued. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth just outside my cubicle, their presence pressing in on me, the sound of each step growing louder and louder. I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair back. My eyes scanned the office, but there was nothing. The hall was empty. The temperature had dropped again. I could see my breath in the air. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the security guard. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. I tried again, but the call wouldn't go through. Suddenly, the lights above me flickered again, this time blinking rapidly before going out entirely. The entire office plunged into darkness. My pulse raced, and panic began to set in. The hallway was pitch black, and I could barely make out the outline of my desk through the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. I felt a cold breeze brush against my cheek. The hairs on my arms stood up. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No response. I fumbled for my flashlight, which I always kept in my desk drawer, and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty cubicles and the faint outlines of office furniture. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The footsteps started again, but this time they weren't in the hallway. They were coming from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the back of my cubicle. The beam illuminated the shadows, the corners of the room, but there was no one there. The sound of footsteps, though, continued right behind me. I could feel it. Someone was there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I finally snapped. I ran. I didn't stop to grab my things or even check if the building was locked. I bolted out of the office, through the dark hallway, and into the parking lot, my heart pounding so loudly I thought I might collapse. When I reached my car, I fumbled for the keys, breathless and shaking. I didn't care about the report anymore. I just needed to get out of there. I didn't look back. I didn't return to the office the next day, or the next. Eventually, I heard from a colleague that the office had been renovated and cleaned up a bit, but that building still haunts me. I can still hear those footsteps. I can still feel the cold air and the presence of someone or something lurking in the shadows. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a ghost or if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but whatever it was, I never worked late at that office again, and I never will. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The office was quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to swallow sound. Jenna sat alone at her desk, her eyes glued to the monitor as her fingers flew across the keyboard. The glow from the screen was the only light in the room, the rest of the office shrouded in shadows. It was nearly 11 p.m., and the open-plan office that buzzed with activity during the day was now a ghost town. Jenna didn't mind working late. She liked the solitude. It gave her a chance to focus without the constant interruptions from colleagues. But tonight, the stillness felt oppressive. There was an odd chill in the air, and the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than usual. She adjusted her scarf and tried to brush off the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. The project deadline was looming, and she had promised her boss she'd finish the presentation slides by morning. She glanced at the clock in the corner of her screen. 11:07 p.m. Just a couple more hours, she told herself. Then she'd head home. The sound of a faint creak broke her concentration. Jenna paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. It came again, louder this time, a slow groan of wood shifting under weight. She turned toward the sound, her eyes scanning the empty office. Rows of desks stretched out before her, illuminated only by the occasional blinking light from a printer or phone. Nothing seemed out of place. "It's an old building," she muttered to herself, forcing a smile. "It's probably just settling." She went back to typing, trying to focus on the work in front of her. But then, just as she was getting back into the flow, she heard it again. This time it wasn't just a creak. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a desk. The sound was faint but deliberate, and it was coming from somewhere behind her. Jenna's heart began to race. Slowly, she turned in her chair, her breath catching in her throat. The tapping stopped. The office was empty, at least as far as she could see. The shadows in the far corners of the room seemed darker than before, almost solid. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. It echoed back at her, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. No answer. She shook her head and laughed nervously. "You're just tired," she whispered to herself, imagining things. She stood and stretched, deciding she needed a break. The air felt heavy, pressing against her chest as she walked toward the break room. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered, buzzing faintly. The sound of her footsteps echoed, unnaturally loud in the silence. The break room was small, with a refrigerator humming in the corner and a coffee machine on the counter. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug comforting in her cold hands. Taking a sip, she stared out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, cars passing by on the street below. Everything out there seemed so normal. It was hard to believe how unsettling it felt inside the building. As she turned to leave, something caught her attention. The reflection in the break room window didn't look quite right. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. In the glass, she could see the faint outline of a figure standing in the hallway behind her. Whipping around, she found the hallway empty. Her hands trembled as she set the coffee cup down on the counter. "Okay, this is getting ridiculous," she muttered. She grabbed her phone and checked the time. 11:34 p.m. She considered packing up and finishing her work at home, but the idea of walking through the darkened office to gather her things made her stomach twist. Steeling herself, she walked back toward her desk. The tapping sound started again, louder this time and closer. Jenna's steps faltered as she reached her workstation. The tapping was coming from the cubicle directly across from hers. She stood frozen, her eyes locked on the edge of the desk where the sound originated. Taking a deep breath, she stepped closer and peered around the corner. The cubicle was empty. "Enough," she whispered, her voice cracking. She grabbed her bag and started shutting down her computer. She was done for the night. As she gathered her things, she felt a sudden chill, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. The air grew heavy, making it harder to breathe. Then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Her name. Jenna. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was faint but unmistakable, and it came from directly behind her. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes darting to the darkened office behind her desk. At first, she saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of movement. A shadow, tall, human-shaped, but somehow not solid, slid across the far wall and disappeared into the corner of the room. Jenna's breath hitched. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Jenna grabbed her bag and bolted toward the elevator. Her footsteps echoed loudly as she sprinted down the hall. The tapping sound followed her, growing louder and more frantic. She didn't dare look back. She reached the elevator and slammed the button for the lobby, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped her bag. The doors slid open with a soft ding, and she threw herself inside, frantically pressing the close doors button. As the elevator descended, Jenna leaned against the wall, her chest heaving. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. The lights in the elevator flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. "No, no, no," she whispered, fumbling for her phone. The small beam of light from the flashlight app barely pierced the darkness. She could feel the walls closing in, the air growing colder. And then, in the corner of the elevator, she saw it. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. Its face was pale and featureless, its form shifting like smoke. Jenna's scream caught in her throat as the figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. The elevator jolted to a stop, and the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. The doors slid open to the lobby, and Jenna stumbled out, her legs barely supporting her weight. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She stood on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The building loomed behind her, dark and silent. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move across one of the top-floor windows, but she told herself it was just her imagination. Jenna never worked late again. She quit her job a week later, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, even during the day. Sometimes late at night, she thought she could still hear the tapping, faint and rhythmic, like a ghostly reminder of that night.
Story number 4.
It was a little after 9:30 p.m. when Ethan finally looked up from his desk. He was the last one left in the office, as usual. Working late had become a bad habit, but tonight felt heavier than most. Deadlines loomed over him, and he knew his boss wouldn't accept any excuses. The dull hum of the overhead fluorescent lights and the faint ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds keeping him company. The office was located on the 12th floor of an old downtown building. It had seen better days, with its outdated decor, squeaky floorboards, and occasional flickering lights. During the day, it was noisy and bustling, but at night, the silence was deafening. Ethan often joked with coworkers about how the building felt haunted after hours. Tonight, it didn't feel like much of a joke. Stretching his arms above his head, Ethan decided to take a quick break. His eyes burned from staring at the screen for hours, and his neck was stiff. He got up, grabbed his mug, and walked toward the break room. The hallway was dimly lit, with a few bulbs flickering sporadically. He chuckled nervously. "They really need to get maintenance on this," he muttered to himself. As he stepped into the break room, the light above buzzed loudly and flickered. Ethan froze for a moment, gripping his mug tightly. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee, and the quiet hum of the fridge filled the air. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, letting the warmth of the mug calm his nerves. That's when he heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the office. It was faint, but unmistakable. Ethan stiffened, his heart quickening. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the main office area. He set his mug down and peered out of the break room doorway. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking the silence. No response. Forcing a nervous laugh, Ethan told himself it was nothing, maybe the air vents or the building settling. But as he stood there, listening, the sound came again. This time it was closer. The footsteps stopped abruptly and the silence felt heavier, almost suffocating. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. Grabbing his phone, he turned on the flashlight and stepped cautiously back into the hallway. The beam of light cut through the dim corridor, illuminating the empty desks and cubicles. Everything looked normal, but the feeling of being watched crept up his spine. As he walked back toward his desk, he noticed something odd. One of the chairs at a nearby workstation was turned completely around, facing the opposite direction. Ethan paused, frowning. He was certain it hadn't been like that earlier. "Okay, this isn't funny," he said aloud, hoping to sound braver than he felt. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the far end of the office. Ethan jumped, nearly dropping his phone. His flashlight flicked toward the source of the noise, but all he saw was the empty expanse of desks and partitions. His first instinct was to leave. Whatever was happening, he didn't want to stick around to find out. But his laptop and hours of unsaved work were still on his desk. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to walk back. When he reached his desk, his blood ran cold. The screen of his laptop was on, though he was sure he'd locked it before leaving for the break room. Words were being typed onto the document he'd been working on, but no one was there. "Why are you still here?" Ethan froze, his hands trembling. He stepped back instinctively, nearly tripping over his chair. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The typing stopped. Then slowly, the words began to delete themselves, one letter at a time, until the screen was blank again. A cold draft swept through the office, though none of the windows could open. Ethan grabbed his bag, his mind racing. He didn't care about the work anymore. He just needed to get out. As he turned to leave, the overhead lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a moment before they stabilized. In that brief flicker, he saw something, or someone, standing at the far end of the room. It was a shadowy figure, tall and indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared, paralyzed. The figure didn't move, but he felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. And then it was gone. The lights returned to normal, and the office was empty again. Ethan didn't wait another second. He bolted for the elevator, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty space. When he reached the elevator, he slammed the button repeatedly, glancing over his shoulder. The hallway stretched out behind him, eerily silent. The elevator doors finally opened, and he stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, a chill ran down his spine. He looked up and saw, reflected in the polished metal walls of the elevator, the same shadowy figure standing at the entrance to the hallway. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight, but the image burned into his mind. Ethan didn't stop running until he was in his car, the engine roaring to life. He drove home, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying the events over and over. The next day, he told his manager he needed to work remotely for a while. He didn't go into details, but he knew he couldn't step foot in that office again, not at night, and maybe not ever. Weeks later, he heard a story from a coworker about the building's history. Decades ago, it had been the site of a fire that had claimed several lives, including that of a late-night office worker who had been trapped on the 12th floor. Ethan didn't share what he'd experienced, but he didn't need to. He knew he wasn't the only one who had felt something in that building. He never stayed late at work again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The office was eerily quiet that night, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I glanced around the darkened cubicles, each one a hollow shell of a space where my coworkers should have been. It was already past midnight, and I was the last one left in the building, finishing up a project that had taken far longer than I had expected. The only light that lit the room came from the glow of my computer screen, casting an unnatural blue light across my desk. I had always been one of the few who stayed late at work. It was usually peaceful, the calm of an empty office offering a rare sense of clarity. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, the effect of working too many late nights. But then I heard it. A soft thud. Like something or someone had knocked over a stack of papers somewhere down the hallway. I straightened up in my chair, my heart rate quickening. The office was locked up tight. There shouldn't be anyone else here. I leaned back in my chair, trying to dismiss the sound as my imagination playing tricks on me. But there it was again, louder this time, a scraping noise like furniture being moved. I pushed my chair back and stood up, slowly making my way toward the hallway. The building was old, the walls stained with the passage of time. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to dance at the edges of my vision. I glanced around the empty desks, each one just as I had left it. The hallway was still, save for the occasional hum of the air conditioning. I turned the corner toward the break room, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The hallway stretched out in front of me, long and narrow. I could hear my footsteps echoing off the tile floor, but there was nothing else. No sign of movement. The air felt cold, and I could see my breath as I exhaled, a strange chill that didn't make sense given the temperature of the building. I pushed open the door to the break room, but it was empty. The lights above flickered, and I stood there for a moment, scanning the room. It looked exactly as it always did. A small table, a few chairs, a coffee maker in the corner. I was about to turn and leave when I saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper on the counter, right next to the sink. I didn't remember seeing it there before. I walked over and picked it up. The paper was thin, yellowed with age. It looked like it had been there for a long time, but it was fresh to me. I unfolded it, revealing a single word written in jagged handwriting: leave. My blood ran cold. I stood there frozen, staring at the note. There was no reason for it to be there. No one had been in this break room for hours. It didn't make any sense. I quickly shoved the paper into my pocket and turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something. A soft sound, like a breath, but deeper, more guttural. It came from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the empty break room. The silence felt suffocating, and my mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was the stress of the job or the isolation of the late hours. I was imagining things, but then the lights above me flickered again, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, a shiver crawling down my spine. I could hear the whisper now, clear as day, coming from the other side of the room. Leave. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. The whisper had been faint, almost lost in the hum of the air conditioning, but now it was unmistakable, and it wasn't coming from anyone. The voice was too cold, too distant. It didn't feel human. I needed to get out of there. My instincts screamed at me to leave the building, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, as if the air itself had become thick, holding me in place. The whisper came again, more urgent this time, closer. Leave. The lights overhead flickered once more and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I panicked, stumbling toward the door, my hands searching for the handle. The air felt suffocating, and my chest tightened with every breath. I could hear the whispering now, not just from one direction, but all around me. I could feel someone moving in the room, though I couldn't see them. The door finally opened, and I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't look back, but I could feel something following me, getting closer with every step. It was a sensation I couldn't explain, but I knew I wasn't alone. When I reached my desk, I grabbed my things in a panic, ready to leave the building. But just as I was about to turn and head for the exit, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On my desk, under the glow of my computer screen, was a new note. I hadn't seen it there when I had left moments ago. It was the same jagged handwriting. The same word, leave. My hands trembled as I picked up the note, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay. I had to leave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, something that didn't want me to leave. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who had left these notes? What did they want from me? I bolted out of my chair and ran toward the exit, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the doorknob. I didn't look back as I rushed through the darkened building, past the empty desks, past the break room. I didn't care if I left my things behind. I just had to get out. I reached the main door, and for a moment I thought I was safe. But as I stepped out into the night air, I heard it again. The whisper, faint and distant. Leave. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was no longer coming from the building. It was coming from behind me, from the shadows of the parking lot. I didn't look. I didn't dare. I just ran. I ran until I was safely in my car, locking the doors and starting the engine without a second thought. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next day I didn't go into work. I called in sick. And the day after that I didn't return either. I couldn't bring myself to go back. Something about that building, the way the voice had followed me, the way it had seemed to know my every move, had shaken me to my core. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the stress of the job, or maybe it was something I couldn't explain. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, leave. And I knew one thing for sure. I never wanted to go back to that office again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The office was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, amplifying every tiny sound. It was nearly 10 p.m., and Emily was the last person left in the building. She stared at the glowing monitor in front of her, the pale light reflecting off her glasses. The quarterly reports were due by tomorrow morning, and she had volunteered to stay late. Now she was regretting it. The office was housed in an old brick building downtown, the kind with creaky wooden floors and drafty windows. During the day, it bustled with the hum of conversations and the clatter of keyboards. At night, however, it transformed into something else entirely, an expanse of shadows and muffled echoes. Emily had heard rumors from her coworkers about strange happenings, Footsteps in empty halls, doors closing on their own, and fleeting figures caught in the corner of the eye. She had laughed it off as office gossip. Until tonight. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms above her head. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, one flickering slightly in the corner of the room. Emily glanced at the time. 10:14 p.m. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen too long. She decided to take a break and headed to the break room to grab a cup of coffee. The hallway felt colder than usual. She rubbed her arms and quickened her pace, her heels clicking against the floor. The break room was dimly lit, the overhead light flickering when she flipped the switch. Emily hesitated for a moment but shrugged it off. She poured herself a cup of stale coffee from the pot and leaned against the counter. That was when she heard it, a faint rustling sound like papers being shuffled. It came from the direction of her desk. Emily froze, her heartbeat quickening. She was certain she was alone. Setting the coffee down, she crept back toward her workstation. The sound stopped the moment she stepped into the office area. Her desk was just as she had left it, reports neatly stacked, her pen beside the keyboard. She scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Forcing a laugh, she shook her head. "Get a grip, Emily," she muttered to herself. As she turned back to her desk, she caught a movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow darted across the far wall, her breath hitched. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She stood still, straining her ears. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's heating system. Swallowing hard, she walked to the back of the office, where the shadow had seemed to move. She peeked around the corner, finding nothing but the empty cubicles of her coworkers. The air felt heavier here, colder. She shivered and hurried back to her desk. Sitting down, she told herself it was her imagination. Maybe she was just tired. She pulled her chair closer to the desk and resumed typing. The clack of the keys was a comforting rhythm, drowning out the silence. A loud bang shattered her focus. Emily jumped, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound had come from the supply closet at the end of the hall. She hesitated, debating whether to check it out or leave it alone. Curiosity won. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel. She reached the closet door and hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. Taking a deep breath, she yanked it open. The shelves were lined with office supplies, nothing out of place. She let out a shaky laugh, her nerves fraying. As she turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own, inches from her face. Emily screamed and stumbled back, her heart racing. The hallway lights flickered. She bolted back to her desk, grabbing her bag and coat. She'd had enough. She powered down her computer and reached for her phone to call security. Before she could dial, her desk phone rang. The sound was jarring, cutting through the silence like a knife. Emily stared at it, dread pooling in her stomach. The caller ID was blank. Her hands trembled as she picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Silence. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. A faint whisper came through the line, so soft she could barely make it out. It sounded like her name. "Emily?" She slammed the phone down, her breathing ragged. Grabbing her bag, she headed for the elevator. The sooner she got out of the building, the better. The elevator doors opened with a ding, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its descent. She leaned against the wall, trying to calm her racing heart. The elevator jolted to a stop. The lights flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. "No, no, no," she whispered, frantically pressing the buttons. Nothing happened. The air felt stifling, and her breath came in shallow gasps. A faint sound echoed in the elevator, a soft, wet whisper. "Emily." She backed into the corner, her eyes wide. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. Something moved in the darkness. A figure, barely discernible, stood at the far end of the elevator. Its outline was hazy, shifting like smoke. Emily's knees buckled as the figure moved closer, its presence oppressive. "Leave me alone," she screamed. The lights flickered back on. The elevator was empty. Emily was on the floor, clutching her bag to her chest. The elevator dinged and the doors slid open to the lobby. She stumbled out, tears streaming down her face. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She fumbled with her keys and got into her car, locking the doors. Her hands shook as she started the engine. Glancing back at the building, she thought she saw a figure standing in one of the windows watching her. Emily never worked late again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
Here's the story. It was close to midnight, and Ethan was still at the office. The empty workspace stretched out before him, illuminated by the dim glow of desk lamps and the bluish hue of his computer screen. The deadline for the presentation loomed large, and he had volunteered, or rather been volunteered by his boss, to finalize the slides. The office was a large, open-plan design with rows of identical cubicles. By day, it bustled with the noise of conversations, keyboard clicks, and the occasional burst of laughter. But at night, it was a different place entirely. The hum of the HVAC system and the occasional pop of the old building settling were the only sounds. It felt like a mausoleum, the silence oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides. Ethan rubbed his temples, exhaustion setting in. He'd been at it for hours, and the lines of text on the screen were beginning to blur. He stood, stretching, and decided to grab a coffee from the break room to shake off the fatigue. As he walked through the office, his footsteps echoed, unnervingly loud in the stillness. The break room was at the far end of the floor. Ethan flicked on the light, which buzzed briefly before illuminating the small space. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air as he poured himself a cup. He stared out the window, sipping slowly, letting his mind wander. The city lights glittered in the distance, but the office building itself was dark and lifeless. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. Or so he thought. As he turned to leave, a faint sound caught his attention. It was subtle at first, like the soft shuffle of papers or a chair being moved. He froze, listening intently. The sound came again, clearer this time, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from the direction of his desk. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding far too loud. He waited, but no one responded. His first thought was that someone from the cleaning crew was still around, but they usually started on the lower floors and wouldn't come to this level until much later. Ethan walked back toward his desk, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had started. When he reached his desk, it was empty, exactly as he had left it. He glanced around, scanning the nearby cubicles. Everything was in its place. The silence returned, heavier than before. "Must be the building settling," he muttered to himself, trying to brush off the unease creeping up his spine. He sat back down and resumed his work, but the feeling lingered, like he wasn't truly alone. Minutes turned into hours as Ethan focused on the presentation. He was deep into editing a slide when his computer screen flickered. He frowned, leaning back in his chair. The flickering stopped, but now the screen displayed something he hadn't typed. "Who's there?" Ethan's stomach dropped. He blinked, staring at the text. "What the hell?" he whispered. He tried deleting the text, but it wouldn't go away. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. Before he could process what was happening, the screen flickered again and the text changed. "Leave now." A chill ran down his spine. He stood abruptly, knocking his coffee cup over. The dark liquid spilled across his desk, but he barely noticed. His eyes darted around the office. The shadows seemed deeper now, the darkness in the corners almost alive. "Is someone messing with me?" he said aloud, his voice shaking. He grabbed his phone and shone its flashlight around the cubicles, the beam cutting through the gloom. Nothing. But then he heard it again. The tapping. Louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from his desk. It was coming from the far end of the office, near the meeting rooms. Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him to grab his things and leave, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of him. He walked toward the sound, his phone's flashlight trembling in his hand. The tapping grew louder as he approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the meeting room, he saw the door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open cautiously. The room was empty, the chairs neatly arranged around the long table. He stepped inside, scanning the space. The tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, just as he turned to leave, he saw it. On the far wall, scrawled in jagged black letters, were the words. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair. The writing hadn't been there earlier. He was sure of it. His heart raced as he backed out of the room, and his mind racing for an explanation. As he hurried back toward his desk to grab his belongings, the office lights began to flicker. The once quiet hum of the building now seemed deafening, an ominous vibration that filled the air. And then he saw it. A shadow moved across the far end of the room, long and unnatural. It wasn't the shadow of a person, it was something else entirely. Tall, misshapen, its limbs stretching impossibly long as it moved between the cubicles. Ethan froze, his body paralyzed with fear. The shadow stopped, turning slowly toward him. Though it had no face, he felt its gaze, cold, piercing, and full of malice. Ethan didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the carpeted floor. He reached his desk, grabbed his bag, and sprinted toward the elevator. He jabbed the button repeatedly, glancing over his shoulder. The shadow was closer now, gliding toward him silently, its form shifting and contorting as it moved. Ethan's heart felt like it might explode. The elevator doors opened with a chime, and he threw himself inside, slamming the closed door button. As the doors slid shut, he caught one last glimpse of the office. The shadow stood just outside the elevator, its twisted form barely visible in the flickering light. And then the doors closed, cutting off the horrifying sight. The ride down was agonizingly slow. Ethan's chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, he bolted out of the building without looking back. He didn't stop running until he was safely inside his car. He locked the doors and sat there, shaking, his mind racing. He stared up at the office building, its windows dark and lifeless. Ethan never went back to that office. He quit his job the next morning, sending an email from the safety of his home. He didn't care about the presentation, the deadline, or even the paycheck. Whatever he had experienced that night was enough to convince him that some things were better left unexplained. Even now, months later, he can't shake the memory of that shadow, of the words scrawled on the wall. Sometimes in the dead of night, he wakes up in a cold sweat, convinced he hears that same rhythmic tapping. And sometimes he wonders if whatever was in that office is still there, waiting for someone else to stay late. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The office was bathed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights, the only source of illumination in the otherwise darkened building. It was nearly midnight, and Rachel sat at her desk, the blue light of her computer monitor casting sharp shadows across her face. She sighed, glancing at the pile of reports that still needed to be reviewed. It was going to be another late night. Most of her colleagues had left hours ago, and the cheerful goodbyes had faded into silence as the office emptied. Rachel had stayed behind, as she often did, to finish her work. It wasn't unusual for her to be the last one in the building. The quiet didn't bother her, at least not usually. But tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible weight. The faint hum of the air conditioning sounded louder than usual, a low, droning noise that seemed to vibrate in her chest. She tried to ignore the unease creeping into her thoughts and focused on the spreadsheet in front of her. She was halfway through updating a set of financial projections when she heard it, a faint creak like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. She froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the far end of the office, near the break room. Rachel turned in her chair, scanning the open plan workspace. Rows of empty desks stretched out before her, their surfaces tidy and devoid of any signs of life. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than they should be, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone else. "It's probably just the building settling," she muttered to herself, though her voice sounded hollow in the empty space. She shook her head and went back to her work, but her concentration was broken. Every small noise seemed amplified, the clatter of the HVAC system, the distant rumble of traffic outside, even the occasional pop of her desk lamp as it warmed the air around it. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but her skin prickled with a sense of being watched. Another sound broke the silence, a soft, muffled thump like something heavy being dropped onto carpet. Rachel's heart jumped. This time, it came from the direction of the supply closet, just a few steps away from her desk. She stared at the door, which was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible beyond. For a moment, she considered leaving. She could pack up her laptop and finish the reports from home, but then she shook her head. "You're being ridiculous," she told herself. "There's nothing there." Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stood up, her chair rolling back with a soft squeak. Slowly, she walked toward the supply closet. The faint scent of cleaning products wafted out as she approached, mingling with the stale air of the office. She reached out a hand and pushed the door open. The closet was small and cluttered, its shelves stacked with reams of paper, boxes of pens, and various office supplies. Nothing seemed out of place. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and turned to leave. That's when she saw it. On the wall opposite the closet, near the edge of the cubicle row, a dark shape darted past. It was fast, almost too fast for her eyes to register, but she knew she had seen something, a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. Silence. She stepped back into the main office area, her eyes scanning the rows of desks and chairs. Everything was still, the silence oppressive. Her gaze lingered on the far corner of the room, where the shadow had disappeared. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting brief bursts of darkness that made her stomach churn. Rachel clenched her fists, trying to steady her nerves. "It's just your imagination," she said out loud, as if hearing her own voice would make it true. But she couldn't ignore the chill creeping up her spine, the way the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She returned to her desk, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Sitting down, she pulled her phone out of her bag and glanced at the time. 11:42 p.m. She debated calling someone, maybe her boyfriend or even her boss, to tell them about the strange noises. But what would she say? That she was scared of shadows and creaking floors? They'd laugh it off, tell her to go home and get some rest. As she reached for her mouse, her computer screen suddenly went black. The monitor's glow vanished, leaving her in near darkness. She jiggled the mouse, but nothing happened. The office lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the room into an unnatural strobe effect. A low, guttural sound cut through the silence. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from directly behind her. Rachel froze, every muscle in her body locking in place. She didn't dare turn around, her mind racing. She could feel the presence now, cold and suffocating, like a weight pressing against her back. Slowly, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. She activated the flashlight and spun around, the beam cutting through the darkness. The space behind her was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavy, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her phone's flashlight flickered, and for a split second she thought she saw a face in the beam's reach. A pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. She screamed, dropping the phone. The flashlight spun as it hit the floor, the light creating chaotic, shifting shadows. Rachel didn't wait to see if the face was real. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the elevator. Her footsteps echoed loudly as she ran, the sound almost drowned out by the blood rushing in her ears. She jabbed the elevator button repeatedly, glancing over her shoulder. The office behind her was dark and still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. The elevator doors opened with a ding, and she rushed inside, slamming the button for the lobby. The doors began to close, but just before they shut completely, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the office, watching her. The ride down felt agonizingly slow. Rachel leaned against the wall, her breathing ragged. The elevator groaned as it descended, the lights flickering overhead. She pressed herself into the corner, clutching her bag like a shield. When the elevator finally reached the lobby, the doors opened to reveal the empty reception area. Rachel ran through the glass doors and into the cold night air. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands fumbling with the keys. Once inside, she locked the doors and started the engine, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The building loomed behind her, its dark windows reflecting the streetlights. For a moment, she thought she saw movement on the top floor, a faint flicker of light, like someone pacing back and forth. She shook her head and peeled out of the parking lot, refusing to look back. Rachel never worked late again. She told her boss she couldn't handle the overtime, and he didn't question her. But every now and then, when she passed the building on her way home, she felt that same oppressive weight, as if the shadows inside were watching, waiting for her to return.
Story number 9.
The office was eerily silent. as it always was after everyone else had gone home. Jenna glanced at the clock on her computer screen. 10:47 p.m. She sighed and rubbed her tired eyes. She had promised herself she wouldn't stay late again, but deadlines were merciless, and she needed to finish the financial report before tomorrow morning's meeting. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed faintly, casting their harsh white glow over the otherwise darkened office. Beyond her cubicle, the open floor plans stretched into the shadows, illuminated only by the glow of computer monitors left in sleep mode. It was an empty sea of desks and chairs, a space that felt unnaturally vast when no one else was around. Jenna shifted uncomfortably in her chair. It wasn't the first time she had stayed late, but tonight felt different. The silence wasn't calming. It was oppressive, heavy with an unseen presence. She tried to shake the feeling off as paranoia brought on by exhaustion. She clicked through a few more spreadsheets, her focus waning. As she leaned forward, she thought she heard something faint, a sound like the creak of a chair. She froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound didn't come again. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart beating faster. Nothing. Just the empty office, the same as it had been all night. "You're hearing things," she muttered under her breath, turning back to her work. The sooner she finished, the sooner she could leave. Minutes passed, and she became engrossed in the numbers on her screen. But then, there it was again. A faint sound, this time like footsteps, soft, deliberate, and drawing closer. Jenna stiffened, her breath catching. She strained to listen, her ears searching for any hint of movement. "Hello?" She called out, her voice trembling slightly. The sound of her own voice startled her in the stillness. No one responded. Grabbing her phone, Jenna switched on the flashlight and stood up, peering over the walls of her cubicle. The light cast long, distorted shadows across the room, but everything looked as it should. She stepped out cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. "Is someone there?" She tried again, louder this time. Her voice echoed faintly, but the office remained silent. She walked toward the break room, the source of the sound, or at least where she thought it had come from. The break room was empty, its small table and chairs neatly arranged. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner, a small comfort in the overwhelming silence. Jenna exhaled slowly, laughing nervously at herself. "Just your imagination," she muttered, turning to head back to her desk. As she walked, she noticed something strange. One of the swivel chairs at a nearby desk was slowly spinning, as though someone had just pushed it. Jenna stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. The chair creaked faintly as it turned, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet office. "Okay, no," she said aloud, her voice shaking. "This isn't funny." The chair stopped spinning abruptly, as if on command. Jenna stared at it, her throat dry. Her logical mind told her it was just an air current, or maybe the building settling. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. A sudden, cold draft swept past her, making her shiver. She turned, shining her flashlight into the dark corners of the office. For a split second, she thought she saw movement, a shadow darting just out of sight. Her breath hitched, and she backed away, bumping into the desk behind her. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The only response was the hum of the lights overhead. Jenna's phone vibrated in her hand, making her jump. She looked down at the screen. It was a notification from her calendar. 11 p.m., it read. Time to wrap up and head home. Her hands trembled as she swiped the notification away. She had had enough. Forget the report. She could finish it in the morning. She hurried back to her desk, gathering her belongings as quickly as possible. But as she reached for her bag, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her computer screen, which she had left on the spreadsheet, now displayed something else entirely. A single word written in the middle of a blank document. "Stay!" Jenna's heart slammed against her ribs. She hadn't typed that. No one else was here. She grabbed her phone, her bag, and her coat, and bolted for the door. As she reached the elevator, she frantically pressed the button, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. The office felt alive now, humming with an energy she couldn't see but could feel in her bones. The elevator doors opened with a chime, and she stepped inside, hitting the ground floor button repeatedly. As the doors began to close, she saw it. A figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the office, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, its silhouette impossibly thin, with long arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a featureless void. Jenna's scream caught in her throat as the elevator doors shut, cutting off her view. The ride down felt like an eternity. When the doors finally opened, she sprinted out of the building without looking back. The cold night air hit her like a wave, but she didn't stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and finally managed to unlock the door. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the building's front windows. But there was nothing. Just the empty office, its lights glowing faintly in the night. Jenna didn't return to work the next day or the day after that. She quit her job via email, refusing to set foot in that building ever again. But even now, months later, she sometimes dreams of the office. In her dreams, she's always alone, sitting at her desk, with the sound of footsteps growing louder and louder behind her. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The clock on Claire's desk read 11:23 p.m. She let out a sigh and leaned back in her chair, staring at the dimly lit office around her. The financial firm she worked for demanded late hours sometimes, but this week had been especially brutal. She was the last one in the building, tasked with finalizing a report that her boss needed first thing in the morning. The office was an open layout with rows of cubicles stretching across the floor and glass-walled conference rooms lining the far wall. By day, it was bustling with noise and activity, but at night, it was eerily silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed muffled, as if the building itself had gone to sleep. Claire rubbed her eyes and focused on her screen, typing numbers into a spreadsheet. The harsh light from her desk lamp created a small oasis in the otherwise darkened space. She glanced at her phone. No messages, no calls, just the creeping realization that she was utterly alone. A faint noise broke her concentration, a creak, like a door slowly opening. Claire froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She listened, her heart picking up speed. The sound came again, more distinct this time. It was coming from the direction of the break room. "Hello?" she called out, her voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response. Claire shook her head and laughed nervously. "Get it together," she muttered to herself. The building was old, prone to groans and creaks as it settled. She tried to focus on her work, but her concentration was broken. A few minutes later, she heard it again. This time, it was the faint sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving across the floor just beyond her cubicle. Claire's chest tightened. "Is someone there?" she asked, louder now. Still no answer. She grabbed her phone and stood up, peering over the walls of her cubicle. The rows of desks and chairs stretched out into the darkness. At the far end of the office, the break room door was ajar, the light inside flickering faintly. Claire hesitated, debating whether to investigate. She knew the cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until much later, and the security guard was usually stationed on the ground floor. So who, or what, was moving around? She took a deep breath and stepped out of her cubicle. Her heels clicked softly on the carpeted floor as she made her way toward the break room. The sound of her own footsteps was unnervingly loud, each step amplifying the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. When she reached the door, she pushed it open cautiously. The fluorescent light above flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. The break room was empty, just as she'd expected. A sudden, loud bang echoed through the office, making her jump. It sounded like something had fallen over near the conference rooms. Her heart pounded as she spun around, staring into the darkened expanse of the office. "Okay, this isn't funny," she said, her voice shaking. "Whoever's messing around, just stop." The only response was the hum of the flickering light. She walked briskly toward the conference rooms, her phone flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she approached, she noticed one of the chairs in the nearest room had been knocked over, lying on its side. Claire swallowed hard. She hadn't heard anyone else come in. How had the chair fallen? Her phone vibrated suddenly, and she nearly dropped it. She glanced down at the screen. It was a notification from the building's security system. Motion detected, floor 7. Her stomach sank. She was on the 7th floor. She glanced around, her breathing shallow. "It's just a glitch," she told herself, though she didn't believe it. The building's motion sensors were reliable, and the thought of them detecting movement when no one should be here sent a chill down her spine. She backed away from the conference room and returned to her desk, grabbing her bag and coat. Whatever was happening, she didn't want to stick around to find out. As she made her way to the elevator, the lights above her began to flicker. The soft hum of the air conditioning grew louder, almost like a low moan. Her pace quickened, her heels clicking faster against the floor. When she reached the elevator, she pressed the button repeatedly, willing the doors to open faster. Behind her, the office seemed to stretch into endless shadows. The elevator finally arrived with a chime, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, she caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. Standing at the far end of the office, just beyond the flickering lights, was a figure. It was tall and motionless, shrouded in shadow. Claire couldn't make out any features, but she felt its gaze on her, heavy and unrelenting. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight. Claire's heart raced as the elevator descended. She clutched her bag tightly, her mind racing. When the elevator reached the lobby, she rushed out, nearly colliding with the security guard. "Whoa, slow down," he said, startled. "What's going on?" "Someone's on the 7th floor," Claire said, her voice shaking. "I heard noises, and I saw." She stopped herself, unsure how to describe what she'd seen. The guard frowned. "I just did a sweep of the building an hour ago. No one's here but you." "I'm telling you, someone's up there," she insisted. He nodded slowly. "I'll check it out. Wait here." Claire stood near the front desk, her eyes darting toward the darkened hallways leading deeper into the building. The minutes dragged on as she waited. Finally, the guard returned, his expression unreadable. "There's no one up there," he said. "What about the chair in the conference room and the motion sensors?" "Everything's in its place," the guard said firmly. Claire shook her head. "I know what I saw. I know what I heard." The guard hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "You're not the first to say that," he said quietly. "A few people have mentioned strange things happening late at night. Doors closing on their own, lights flickering, footsteps when no one else is around." Claire stared at him, her skin crawling. "What are you saying?" He glanced around as if making sure no one else could hear. "They say this building's haunted. Something happened here years ago, before the firm moved in. A fire. A few people didn't make it out." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't wait for him to say more. She muttered a quick thanks and left the building, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her car keys. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure standing at the edge of the office, watching her. Claire handed in her resignation 2 weeks later, unwilling to spend another late night alone in that building. She never told her coworkers why she left, but she avoided that part of town entirely after that. And sometimes late at night, she wondered if the figure she saw was one of the fire's victims, or something far worse. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The hum of the overhead lights was the only sound in the office as Linda typed furiously, trying to finish her report. It was nearly midnight, and everyone else had left hours ago. She had promised herself she'd leave by 8, but the deadline loomed, and the work just kept piling up. It wasn't unusual for her to work late. She liked the quiet of the office at night, the absence of chatter and ringing phones. But tonight, something felt off. The office was in an old building downtown, the kind with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings that amplified every sound. By day, the charm was undeniable. By night, it felt different. Cold drafts seemed to come from nowhere, and the darkness beyond her desk felt heavier than usual. Linda told herself it was just exhaustion making her feel jumpy. She adjusted her glasses, took a deep breath, and went back to typing. The sound of a faint knock broke her concentration. She froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. It wasn't loud, more like a soft rapping against wood, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere down the hall. She listened intently, but the sound didn't come again. Probably just the janitor, she thought. Linda had seen him earlier, pushing his squeaky cart past her desk. She shrugged it off and returned to her work. Minutes later, she heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder and closer, live, coming from the break room just around the corner. Linda's chest tightened. She glanced at the clock. Midnight. The janitor should have finished by now. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. No response. She stood, her chair sliding back with a soft scrape, and walked toward the break room. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor, each step echoing in the stillness. The hallway leading to the break room was dimly lit, the overhead light flickering faintly. Linda reached the door and peeked inside. The break room was empty. The vending machines hummed quietly, and the faint smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. Everything seemed normal. She let out a nervous laugh and turned to head back to her desk. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt it, a distinct, icy breeze brushing against the back of her neck. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned, expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty. "Get a grip, Linda," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. She hurried back to her desk, her heart pounding. She told herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She sat down and tried to refocus on her work, but the words on the screen blurred together. The quiet was oppressive now, each small sound making her flinch. The creak of the floor, the groan of the old building settling, it all felt too loud, too deliberate. And then she heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was coming from her desk. Linda's blood ran cold. She stared at her desk, her hands trembling. The sound came again, louder and more insistent. Slowly, she reached for the drawer where the noise seemed to be coming from. Her fingers brushed the cold metal handle, and she hesitated. Taking a deep breath, she yanked the drawer open. It was empty, save for a few pens and sticky notes. She let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over her. That relief was short-lived. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, drifted through the air. "Linda." She froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. The voice had come from right behind her. She spun around, her chair creaking loudly. No one was there. She grabbed her bag and decided enough was enough. She powered down her computer and stood to leave. As she reached for her coat, she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the far end of the office. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Linda's heart raced as she grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness as she scanned the office. Rows of empty desks stared back at her, their surfaces cluttered with papers and personal knickknacks. But at the far end of the room, just beyond the reach of her light, she thought she saw movement. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. A shadow shifted and her blood ran cold. It wasn't the kind of shadow cast by furniture or office equipment. It was tall, humanoid, and it moved. Linda backed toward the exit, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone. The shadow moved closer and she could feel an icy chill spreading through the air. Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second, she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the darkness. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty sockets, dark and hollow. She screamed and bolted for the stairs, her heels clattering against the floor. She didn't dare look back, afraid of what she might see. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she threw open the stairwell door and ran down the steps. The sound of footsteps followed her, echoing off the concrete walls. They were faster now, almost frantic, matching her pace. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning as she descended floor after floor. When she finally reached the lobby, she burst through the door and into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Fumbling with her keys, she unlocked the door and threw herself inside, locking it behind her. Her hands trembled as she started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot. In her rearview mirror, she could see the office building receding into the distance, its dark windows reflecting the streetlights. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at one of the windows, watching her. Linda never stayed late at work again. She requested to move to a different location, but even in her new office, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. Sometimes late at night, she would hear faint knocks or feel a cold breeze brush against her neck. And sometimes just before falling asleep, she thought she could hear a whisper. Linda, story the end.
Story number 12.
Here's the story. It was almost 10 p.m., and Naomi was still at her desk. She had promised her boss the finalized report by the next morning, and the weight of that promise kept her in the empty office building long after everyone else had gone home, The building was an older structure, the kind with squeaky floors and dim, yellowish overhead lights that buzzed faintly. By day, the place was full of energy, colleagues laughing, printers whirring, phones ringing. But at night, it was a different story. The usual warmth drained away, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against Naomi's senses. She stretched her arms, her back aching from sitting hunched over her desk for hours. Her cubicle, tucked near the corner of the floor, felt like a small island in a sea of darkened workstations. She glanced out the window, noticing the faint reflection of her own tired face staring back at her against the backdrop of the city lights. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a message from her boyfriend, asking if she was on her way home. She typed a quick reply, "Almost done. Just another hour or so." As she hit send, she heard a noise. It was faint, but unmistakable, a soft clicking sound like the sound of heels on the tile floor of the hallway. She froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The cleaning crew? She thought, though she knew they usually didn't come to her floor until after midnight. "Hello?" she called out, her voice breaking the silence. No response. Naomi tried to shake off the creeping unease. She figured it was probably the old building settling or her tired mind playing tricks on her. She turned back to her work, but it was harder to focus now. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't just clicking anymore. It was accompanied by the faint rustle of fabric, like someone brushing past the edge of a cubicle. Naomi's pulse quickened. She stood up, peering over the low walls of her cubicle. The office was a shadowy labyrinth of desks, chairs, and partitions, but everything looked exactly as it should. "Is someone there?" she called again, louder this time. Silence. Her gaze shifted toward the far end of the room, where the hallway led to the conference rooms and break area. She squinted, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. Was that movement? A faint shadow seemed to dart out of sight, just at the edge of the hallway. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding now. She picked up her phone, holding it tightly as she stepped cautiously out of her cubicle. Her footsteps sounded unnaturally loud against the carpet as she moved toward the hallway. The air felt heavier as she approached, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. She flicked on the flashlight on her phone, the narrow beam of light cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" She called again, her voice trembling. This time, there was a sound, a faint whisper, too soft to make out. It sent a shiver down her spine. Naomi stopped in her tracks, straining to listen. The whisper came again, clearer now, though it didn't make sense. It sounded like her name. Naomi. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the empty office. There was no one there. This is ridiculous, she thought, trying to calm herself. You're just tired. It's nothing. She turned and headed back toward her desk, determined to finish the report and get out of there as quickly as possible. But as she sat down, her computer screen flickered. She stared at it, confused. The report she'd been working on disappeared, replaced by a blank screen. And then slowly words began to appear, typed out as if by an invisible hand. "Why are you still here?" Naomi's breath hitched. She stared at the screen, unable to move. Her hands trembled as she reached for the mouse, trying to close the window, but the cursor wouldn't move. The words on the screen changed. "You shouldn't be here." Her chair screeched against the floor as she pushed it back and stood up, heart racing. Her first thought was that someone was remotely accessing her computer, but deep down, she knew that wasn't it. A loud bang echoed from the direction of the conference room, snapping her out of her thoughts. It sounded like a door slamming shut with incredible force. Naomi grabbed her bag and decided she'd had enough. Whatever was happening, she wasn't sticking around to find out. She practically ran toward the elevator, her footsteps echoing in the empty office. She pressed the elevator button repeatedly, glancing over her shoulder as she waited. The oppressive silence was broken only by her own ragged breathing. The elevator doors finally slid open, and she stepped inside, jamming her finger against the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, she thought she saw something move in the reflection of the polished metal walls. Something dark and shapeless, standing near her cubicle. The ride down felt agonizingly slow. Naomi clutched her bag to her chest, her mind racing. When the doors opened to the lobby, she bolted out of the building without looking back. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to calm herself. Her logical mind told her it was just her imagination, the result of stress and exhaustion. But a part of her, the part that still felt the cold weight of that whisper in her ears, knew it wasn't. Naomi called her boss the next morning and told him she was sick. She didn't mention the incident at work, unsure how to explain what had happened without sounding crazy. A few days later, she overheard a conversation between two coworkers. They were talking about a woman who had worked late in the office years ago. She'd been found dead in one of the conference rooms, the victim of a sudden heart attack. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine as the pieces clicked into place. The whispers, the typing on her screen, the oppressive feeling of being watched. It wasn't her imagination. She never worked late again. Story the end.